Hi there. In this video, I'll be talking with you about how I like to get the best out of the Personal Impact Report, or the PIR, when working with leaders on how to effectively manage stress through a better understanding of their MBTI preferences. I'll be focusing on working with groups of leaders and leadership teams. The things I hear from leaders is that stress is not just about learning to cope with a heavy workload. I often also hear about the challenges of keeping up with the rapid pace of change, worrying about the well-being of employees, and not feeling able to or finding it difficult to create a healthy work-life balance in the always-on culture. Working with leaders to better understand their stress reactions through the lens of MBTI type can be a very powerful way of becoming much more conscious of the nature of these reactions, and then better able to cope effectively with the stresses in their work and in their life. In my work with groups of leaders and leadership teams, the light bulb moments are often along the lines of the statements on the slide. The activity I'm about to talk through assumes the participants have reached closure on their verified or best fit type before attending the session. And while I'm introducing it as a virtual session, it works really well face-to-face too. Sending the PIR out in advance to participants, assuming they're comfortable with their verified type, of course, can be a really powerful way of getting them warmed up and in the right mindset for the session. And what I've found works really well is to get participants to review the How Stress Impacts You section of the PIR in advance of the session, and I'll show you that later, and actively engage with this by capturing their responses to some pre-session reflection prompts, as on the screen. And while they do so, to note examples of their main stress triggers, the behaviors others might observe in them when they're experiencing stress, and what might be going on for them under the surface that others might not actually see. And you can find these pre-session prompts and details of the exercise in the supporting document that accompanies this video. The team in my example had an organizational restructure underway and was certainly feeling the pressure. So I felt it was really important to start with the gifts of their type as a reminder of the strengths that they could draw on to take care of themselves in this time of intense pressure. So I asked leaders to share in small groups of 3 to 4 in virtual breakout rooms the characteristics of their type at its best. And I will share my screen again, because what I did was get them to look at this page. So the snapshots of the 16 type is what they're looking at, and then they find the snapshot that's relevant to their type. And then the next page, under the ENTP work highlights, and then also these words were also a potential source of inspiration for their discussion. What I also did was get them to work with the strengths section of the MBTI app, but I'll show you that a bit later on. And then I asked them in these small groups to discuss with each other examples of how these gifts of their type show up when they're feeling resourceful, explaining that the next part of the activity would look at what happens when they're experiencing stress. So I ran this exercise in mixed preference groups so that they could hear some of the diversity in styles during the discussions, then debriefing in plenary to get each group to share some of these differences. And I then explained what happens to MBTI types under everyday and extreme stress. So I'll share my screen again for that, as this is a helpful diagram to use when you're explaining this. So I explained that the characteristics of our type at their best can become exaggerated and overused once we move beyond helpful levels of stimulation into stress, which starts to negatively affect our performance and our interactions. And then if stress levels increase until we're under extreme pressure, we can fall into the grip of our fourth process, or the inferior function, where we start to behave in an out of character manner, and things can feel much more difficult to cope with. Our reactions and what's needed to rebalance will look and feel different depending on our type. I then got participants back into the same small groups, explaining that they would be working with the How Stress Affects You part of their PIR, as well as the stress section in the MBTI app, although the information in the report works really well on its own. So let me show you that now. Okay, so I asked them to have a look at the stresses section and the signs of stress for their type in this part of the activity, along with the information in the app, which I'll show you in a moment. And then in the next part of the activity, I got them to look at best ways to manage stress and worst ways to respond. So let's just take that down for a moment and switch over to the app so I can show you that quickly. Okay. So for the first part of the exercise, which I talked about a moment ago, I got them to have a look at the strengths and pull out some of the characteristics from that. And then in this looking at the stresses and so on section, I got them to look at the stress section of the app, which also provides information about how people tend to respond under extreme or prolonged stress. And what I invited them to do was to share real examples with each other of behaviors that others might see in them when they're experiencing stress. As I've said, looking at the signs of stress in the PIR and talking about which ones particularly resonated and exploring with the colleagues which of the signs they had seen in each other. And then as a debrief, I asked each leader to share with the group one sign that their colleagues could look out for, which would indicate that they were experiencing stress and that they might perhaps need some support. For the next part of the activity, in different groups, participants discussed coping strategies and how they could support each other. And so I asked them to have a look at the best ways to manage stress and worst ways to respond to stress bullets in their report, which I showed you a moment ago, and identify those which resonated, exploring productive ways to manage stress and the ways that they could support each other. And then the debrief for this part of the activity focused on some team action planning. So just show you that now, where I put up a virtual whiteboard and asked leaders to discuss and capture their responses to the questions shown on the slide, which of course you could change depending on the focus of the team action planning and the context and needs of the team. I then followed this up with some individual action planning to encourage team members to use their personal impact report to help them apply their insights beyond the session. And I provided them with an action planning worksheet to help with this, an example of which you can find in the additional resources accompanying this video. And then as this team had agreed to share their types in a previous session I'd run with them, they already had a soft copy of the Who Are We type table, but I will show you a copy of that now. So if you are using this editable PDF on a desktop, then you can actually type the names into the boxes. If, like me, using it on a tablet, then you can actually write the names in. And I will just write in some random names so you can see what I mean. Obviously, as with any sharing of type information, it's important to get people's agreement that they're happy to share their information in this way. And one thing to add here was that if they'd been co-located, I would have provided a poster version of that type table. So I hope that these hints and tips will prove useful as you use the PIR to enrich your work, stumbling over my words there, with leaders around using type insights to better understand their and other stress reactions and coping strategies. But as a final thought before I go, I wanted to mention a standalone MBTI stress management report as an alternative to the PIR. While you would lose the benefit of all the rich information relating to the other application areas that is available within the PIR, the stress management report does have some extra content, as I will show you shortly. So here in this page, you have some characteristics that you can use in the gifts of your type exercise. What happens when you experience stress, and then on the next page, signs of stress, some things to be aware of in their opposite, and then stresses, which are similar to what you would find in the PIR, and then, as also in the PIR, the best ways to manage stress and the worst ways to respond, plus some information about how this can support you, and then some tips for learning from your stress reactions. So that brings me to the end of my time with you. Thank you very much for joining me today. And I wish you all the best as you work with leaders to harness their insights about MBTI type to manage stress. Take care.